traditional lands and waterways of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present, we acknowledge with honor and gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. We are members of the Indigenous New Hampshire Collaborative Collective. My name is Burnett, and I'm an Anthropology and Sustainability dual major.
And I'm Jeff Baron, and I'm an Anthropology major and Earth Science and Brewing minor.
We just read a land acknowledgement written by the INHCC for use at UNH. There's been a push in the last decade for acknowledgement of Indigenous land, an initiative we collectively acted upon this semester. The Indigenous New Hampshire Collaborative Collective is a transdisciplinary group of students, faculty, Indigenous peoples, activists, organizers, historians, and community members. We come from a variety of ethnicities, places of origin, ages, educational backgrounds, and experiences, but work together to reframe the colonial narratives of New Hampshire history, past and present, from an Indigenous perspective.
Far too often, our historical narratives are incomplete and one-sided. American history courses usually begin with Christopher Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. The continent that would be called the New World, and later America, by explorers and settlers, was anything but new for those who had lived there for millennia. The first inhabitants arrived at least 15,000 years ago, and probably as far back as 30,000 years ago, crossing into America via the Beringia land bridge. At this time, however, the Laurentide ice sheet extended from the Canadian Rockies in the west all the way to the east coast and as far south as Pennsylvania. New Hampshire was covered by this glacier until approximately 12,000 years ago. The first culture to spread across the continent into this region were the Paleo-Indians. They lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers and migrated around the region seasonally in search of food sources like caribou herds. This phase of occupation lasted until around 9,000 years ago. The Paleo-Indian Phase was followed by the Archaic Phase, which is marked by an increase in the diversity and abundance of food sources as the climate warmed. People lived in seasonal camps and began a shift towards a more settled lifestyle. Around 3,000 years ago, the Archaic period gave way to the Woodland period. This period saw the adoption of agricultural practices, which led to an increase in overall population size and continued to shift towards a more sedentary lifestyle. People lived in large villages called Odina in the Abenaki language. In the final days before European contact, the total population of North America was as high as 50 million people, but the first European explorers brought with them a deadly and invisible weapon, disease. These diseases decimated indigenous populations, killing as much as 90% of the population by the time permanent European settlements were established. The colonizers pushed west to feed the demand for new land, displacing, removing, and warring with indigenous groups. The indigenous perspective was marginalized, and history was dominated by colonial narratives. This image shows a reconstruction of the boundaries of the Abenaki homeland, or Ndakina. When decolonizing the historical narrative, it is important to view the land as the Abenaki would have, outside of arbitrary borders imposed during the European conquest.
Our work is done through the use of decolonizing methodologies, which are described by Indigenous Maori scholar Linda Tuhiwai-Smith as a more critical understanding of the underlying assumptions, motivations, and values that inform research practices. We cannot undertake research or community outreach in ways that simply replicate Western and colonial ideals and practices. Knowing this, one of the challenges we face is avoiding the use of colonized terms, especially in academic contexts, like the archaeological background we just presented. However, our work must bring in and lift up Indigenous voices, support Indigenous issues, and actively work against colonial narratives that ignore or silence Indigenous peoples. One of our main methodologies includes, but isn't limited to, storytelling through the use of podcasts, videos, and the story map. This was one of our original projects that uses geospatial technology to create an interactive map recontextualizing the landscape to tie it to its Indigenous history. Our collaborative process brings together people and ideas from a variety of backgrounds. This doesn't always make it easy to come to a consensus when making decisions, but it is critical to our process and use of decolonizing methodologies. We use careful listening of Indigenous voices, and our meetings consist of open discussions. While these take time, and we may not always agree, we believe that these are important for ensuring equity in our process. Our collaborators vet the writing that is produced to make sure it is accurate and reflective of the Indigenous narrative. Our work has 3 focal points. First, our projects have a local focus here in New Hampshire and largely on the New Hampshire seacoast. Second, we focus on public education, working to decolonize the history of the area through changes in the curriculum, including Indigenous dialogue. Third, we take part in restorative justice activism, advocating for changes on the local and state level that acknowledge Indigenous history and current presence. This year, 3 projects have reflected these aims: generating knowledge about Indigenous Peoples Day and the problematic nature of celebrating Columbus, the New Hampshire Social Studies Conference in Manchester, and the Mountains of New Hampshire project. This past year, Durham became the first town in New Hampshire to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day in place of Columbus Day. However, UNH has not yet adopted this change. To encourage this initiative to be taken both by UNH and the state of New Hampshire, like Durham, Maine, and Vermont have, the INHCC has conducted public outreach. We spoke with students at UNH and created a video of their knowledge of Columbus and Indigenous Peoples Day. We created a podcast providing information on a House bill that would change the day to Indigenous Peoples Day and how citizens could advocate for change, and hosted an open forum at the university where Indigenous panelists and professors spoke to why the change should occur.
In the fall of 2018, 3 members of the INHCC attended the New Hampshire Social Studies Conference in Manchester. At the conference, they conducted workshops with New Hampshire teachers to discuss methods for integrating Indigenous history into the classroom. These methods include access to open source resources like videos, podcasts, and blog posts. To further these goals, we are working with the Education Department at UNH to develop K-12 curriculums that cover Indigenous history, and working with the Sustainability Institute to promote the use of Indigenous foods in New Hampshire schools. The INHCC also developed a small exhibit on Indigenous land use in the White Mountains that was displayed in Diamond Library. We investigated several peaks in the Wabanadenock, or the place of the High White or Crystal Mountains. In the exhibit, we used Abenaki place names for these mountains and looked at what they meant to Indigenous people in spiritual, historical, and utilitarian ways. The exhibit can currently be viewed in the Anthropology department in Huddleston Hall.
In the past 2 semesters, we've accomplished the goals we set out at last year's URC presentation, beginning to develop Indigenous curriculum in public education, expanding the project, and creating a web of connections. This year, we developed the land acknowledgement you heard at the beginning of the presentation, and we worked within our community to encourage awareness of privilege and the use of that privilege to advocate for Indigenous issues. While continuing to expand these projects, we will also be conducting a boat tour of Lake Winnipesaukee, exploring the Indigenous history of the area. We will continue campaigning for change for Indigenous Peoples Day, and we'll be working here at UNH toward creating a Native American and Indigenous Studies minor. Finally, we hope to engage new students in our work. If you're interested in the work you've heard about today and want to get involved, you can speak to any of us after the event. Thank you for your time.